Hey, a SQL file. Let's see what's inside of it. Select first name. Oh, what is this? This is a mess. Hold on, let me fix this. 1 second, and let's reopen the file. Mwah. That is much better. Today, we're talking about how we can format our SQL files automatically using a tool called sqlfmt. sqlfmt is a developer tool. It formats your SQL files for you so you don't have to. The thing I like most about this tool is that there's only one way to format your SQL code. This means that when you meet with your coworkers, you don't have to argue about if you're going to use uppercase or lowercase, if you're going to have trailing commas or leading commas for your column names, or how you're going to indent your code. sqlfmt takes care of that for you so you can focus on the actual logic. Today I'll show you how I use sqlfmt in my workflow, and we'll also set it up in a Git repo to run automatically. Let's get started. To use sqlfmt, we have to get sqlfmt. In the sqlfmt website, within the documentation, we'll see what we need to get started. If you look through this page, you'll notice that sqlfmt is a Python-based package, so you can use any Python package manager to install the tool. I'm going to use UV-tool. I'll copy this here and go back to the terminal. And if you run this tool, this will install sqlfmt on your machine. I already have it installed, but if I uninstall it, let me just uninstall it so you can see what it would look like for you, and reinstall it again, you'll see that sqlfmt is installed, as well as any dependencies that it needs. If it all goes well, then we should be able to use sqlfmt from the command line. In this case, I'm running version 29, or 0.29. Great, now we have sqlfmt. How do we use it? Well, the easiest way is to type in the command sqlfmt and then enter the name or folder of any SQL files that you want formatted. For example, if we put in a dot for the current directory, sqlfmt will find any SQL files in your current directory and all nested directories, and then format them. But before you hit enter, be warned, this tool will change and save the contents of your file. So it's a good idea to version control your files in something like Git before you let the tool loose on your project. Let me show you some of the things that sqlfmt can do with another file. I'll copy over another file from my originals. And in this file, you can see another SQL query. It's not formatted very well. It has inconsistent capitalization for your keywords. It also has some awkward spacing with delimiters around the parentheses and around our commas. It could use a little bit of work. We can check if this file is formatted by sqlfmt standards without even opening the file using the check flag. We'll type in sqlfmt and then the check flag and then the name of the file that we want to check. And once we hit enter, the sqlfmt will determine if it's formatted properly or not. We already know it's not, but now we can see automatically without opening that it failed the formatting check. Cool. You can also see what sqlfmt would do to the file without letting it change the file, using something called the diff flag. We'll enter sqlfmt again with the diff flag and then target the same query, and this time we'll get an output that looks a little bit like Git, where the original query is shown in red with these minus prefixes, and the proposed formatted code is given in green below with these plus signs. Note that this did not actually change the file. If we look at the file again, we'll see that it's still that same original boring code. All this tells you is what sqlfmt would do if you let it change the file. And if we want to make that change, we would call the command again, but this time remove the diff flag. The file is formatted, and now we can look at it again and see that it has been formatted and saved. You may be thinking, okay, great, this tool works well on formatting my SQL files, but what about templated SQL files? What about all these Jinja tags that I have in my DBT project? Can it work on that? And the answer is yes. sqlfmt is especially designed for the DBT style of SQL files, meaning it works well with Jinja tags. Let me show you with another query. This time, we'll copy over another file that has Jinja tags, and let's open the file. Here we have another messy query. At the very beginning, there's a config tag surrounded by these double curly braces, and if you're brave enough to go through the actual code, you'll notice other Jinja tags. Here we have a reference tag, and here we have a source tag. Let's see how sqlfmt would format this. This time we'll use the same diff tag as before. And you can see that it formats it pretty well. The config tag is still at the top, and it's got nice spacing to separate it from the curly braces. And the actual query itself is formatted with those source tags and those reference tags retained. Awesome. But there is a caveat. SQL format is great. It's designed especially for DBT, which means it works primarily with DBT style queries. And most DBT queries are just a bunch of select statements. Let me show you what I mean by going back to the documentation. Here in the SQL format docs, we can go over to maturity and stability. And this page tells you what use cases SQL format is great for and where you might want to watch out. Like I said, because SQL format is designed for DBT first, it's very mature in DBT projects, or in situations where you want to format only select statements. However, it's not as complete when working with other kinds of code, like DDL statements where you're creating tables, or DML statements where you're inserting records into a table. In those cases, SQL format will still try to format your code, but it makes no guarantees. That said, SQL format is a great tool to use on your DBT projects. I use it in my day-to-day life, and it makes it so much easier to not worry about how the code is arranged. I can just focus on the logic. The problem, though, is remembering to use the tool. Sometimes I forget to auto-format the code before I make my Git commit. If only there was a way to run SQL format automatically as I change things in my repo. And there is. Git has something called pre-commit hooks. These are little pieces of code that run before your Git commit completes. And typically these are done using bash scripts, which are sometimes not easy to manage. But there is another tool, a second tool, called Pre-commit. You can install Pre-commit in your repo, and it will ensure that any code quality tools that you want to run are run as you make a commit. You know what? Let's go ahead and make a Git repo and see how we can install this. Let me go back to the terminal, and I'll go over to my temp folder, and I'll make a new folder for my new repo. Let me enter into that repo and initialize it as a Git repo. So I'll say git init, and I have my Git repo. Let's start by making a SQL file. And we'll intentionally use bad formatting. Let's say select with an obnoxious amount of spaces, star from my table. All right, so I have a file. I can stage that file and then make my first commit. Now I have a Git repo with one query. Let's install pre-commit so SQL format can run automatically for us. Back to the docs in pre-commit. On the installation page, you'll see that this is another Python package, and so we can install that using pip or whatever package manager you want to use. I'll use UV tools again. So UV tool install pre-commit. For me, I already have pre-commit installed on my machine, but if you don't have it, this will install it for you. Great, now I have pre-commit installed globally, but I need to set up my repo to run SQL format every time I make a commit. How do we do that? If we go back to the pre-commit docs, you'll see that we need to set up a configuration file called .precommitconfig YAML. So let's create that file in our repo. Oops, not sure where that came from. There we go. And in the file, you basically have a list of different tools that you want to run as you make Git commits. You reference the repo where that tool exists, and then the IDs of any hooks that are present in that file. We want to run SQL format, so if we go back to the SQL format docs, you'll find in the integration page a section for pre-commit. And here is the YAML snippet that we would need for our config file. I'll copy that and paste it here. All right, and our config file is ready. I'll just change version 27 to version 29, since that's the most recent version that I have here. And you'll notice that the actual hook itself is called SQL format, and it's also installing the agenda dependency so we can format those tags for DBT style files. What's next? Well, if you go back to the documentation, you'll notice that we need to install the Git hook that will call pre-commit. And that's done with a simple command called pre-commit install. I'll go back to the terminal and run that. Oops. Pre-Commit has now installed a file, specifically a bash file, in the .git hooks folder. This is the file that is called every time you make a commit. It'll specifically run before the commit is finalized. All right, just one more step for the pre-commit installation. Pre-commit only runs on files that are changed in your commit, meaning it does not change any files that are already existing in your repo or have been unchanged in your current commit. So it's a good idea to make sure that you run pre-commit one time on all your files in your repo. And then every time after that, pre-commit will run for those changed files. The command is pretty simple. It's just pre-commit run all files. So I'll run that in my terminal. And here we'll see pre-commit in action. It's calling that hook called SQL format, which returns a failed status. And that's because that one query that we have there is not formatted properly. But the hook will also format the code for us. Let's see if that's true. We can look in that file and see that instead of our poorly formatted code, we now have something that's a bit more readable. Great. Now if I look at my Git status, I have a modified query SQL file and my new config file. And there's a leaf blower around. Hopefully you don't hear that. So let me stage and commit these changes. Pre-commit will run again. Of course, this time that one file has been formatted well, so the check passes, and we're good to go. Now let's simulate what would happen on an average day when you're working in your repo. Let's create a new file. And like before, we'll intentionally make it poorly formatted. We'll say select all one with some leading commas. Not sure why I'd want to do that, but some people do. And we'll pull it from our saucy table where column 1 is equal to Harry. This is too clean. Let me make it worse. Even worse. Okay, let's see what happens with this. If we have this query made and we want to commit it, we could, of course, stage the query so that it's ready to go. And then if we make a commit, pre-commit will call SQL format, which will say, hey, your code is not formatted poorly. Let me format that for you, and it will format the code. If we wanted to look at this a bit more closely, you'll see that we now have almost 2 versions of this new query. This is the original version that we staged. If we look at it in the staged environment, we see the very poorly formatted code. And if we want to see what SQL formatted did in the modified version, we can just run git diff without the stage flag and see that it has cleaned it up quite nicely. It's put all the columns in one statement, since there's only 3 here, and removed all these extra spaces and also made the capitalization pretty consistent. Cool. So now that this is done, we would restage our files and rerun our commit command. And it passes. And that's it. That's how SQL format can run automatically in your repo. Life's too short to worry about spacing and indentation and where those commas are going to go. You have more important things to debate with your coworkers. Let SQL format handle the formatting for you so you can move on to more exciting things. Until next time, happy coding. Oh, are you still here? You should probably get back to work. Bye!